Hello, Sebastian here from Twin Peaks. In this video, we take a look at the SidiFootprint indicator in NinjaTrader in the Volume-Cluster section. This was a function that was very often requested and is therefore now also available. We have various options for configuring the volume clusters. Firstly, we have a minimum volume that we can set. In this example, I have now made 800 contracts. This means everywhere where we have a volume of at least 800, the criterion is fulfilled. There is a second criterion, price levels to count. This means everywhere where we have this minimum volume of 800 on at least 3 levels on top of each other, such a cluster is formed. So the criterion is met here, here too, and these are precisely these volume clusters, which are used in some trading approaches. The nice thing is that we can configure this freely. We can also say a certain percentage of the max volume of the bar and say, all right, we now have our POC here and where quasi over and down. So 3 price levels together must be here. For example, at least 80% of the volume of the POC is traded. If I want to see the whole thing so that it changes, I have to go to reload. Once, recalculate once. It works relatively quickly, depending on how many days you have loaded in the chart. And then you can see how many zones there still are, correspondingly significantly less. For example, here we have these zones, and here we can now see that we have the POG of 1,099 here and then 80%. Here too, we have the whole thing. And these levels here are also a zone because we have at least 80% of this POG 3 times here. Okay. The level here is dropped because it does not fit the criterion. Here too, we have the whole thing again, and so we can adjust it very finely. That is one possibility. Max volume session bars means that we look at the current session when we have loaded the whole thing, and we check what is the largest POC of the current session. 2001, which is taken as a benchmark as 100%, and then 80% are then interesting for us. This is exciting for us if, for example, we want to look at the maximum volume over the last 3 days. I'll prepare this briefly and show you, just for a moment. I have now loaded, and now we have our volume cluster here accordingly. The whole thing is now on session bars, initially only, use and so, from the current session that we have here, the largest volume. And what we can do now is max volume all bars. It means if now all bars that I have loaded are considered, the largest POC is searched for, the largest volume POG, and 80% of it must then be together. I will now go to reload, and we will take a look at how many more zones there are, because we can, of course, derive corresponding volume clustering from this, especially on larger time units, such as 15 minutes or 1. We can derive from this if necessary. Pull something. Now let's take a look at to see if there were any values here that were of interest to us. There was no 80% here for the time being, is probably just too much because we will have a very, very large buck somewhere here. That means we'll just go down to 50% here and then look accordingly. That we'll take a look at. I reload here once again with F. I don't always have to click in the chart, and that should go relatively quickly now, as we have already calculated this movement once here. As soon as it's finished, we'll see down here, here we've only caught this point once, where we actually had so much volume in one spot that it would be relevant for us here. Because here there were, let's take a quick look in the closing auction. That will have been exactly here, 20 o'clock. There were once simply 4,100 contracts here, and then just as many next to it. Of course, we can now limit the whole thing accordingly if we want to. We say, okay, we want to have it at more levels, at fewer levels, depending on the case. For example, at 1, then we should also see procs, the 80% of the maximum here. The final auction is, of course, always a bit exciting, but we'll give it a try anyway to see if we get the right results there. And then we can work with very large POCs there. Personally, I would always recommend using this only on an intraday basis, which gives the best results, and working with it. But here we now also have, it corresponds to everything from 80% of it, of these levels, in this area here, and otherwise we never had such large volumes again. But there were some back here, So there were also a few larger movements here, larger volumes, with which it was then possible to work. See this here, accordingly. That's what this cluster function is for. And what I like to do is to apply it to 1. Then the breaking goes faster and faster because the current day is only interesting for me. Then I go to the max volume of the bar. And then we do 75% on at least 3 levels. And then we can continue working with it. The next exciting function is the invert function, which is really useful. This allows us to display levels that have particularly small volumes, i.e. empty calculation rooms. Let's take a look right now. Here is still the old calculation. And now we are just interested in the whole thing from the other side. So where was particularly little traded? To do this, we simply go to invert and do nothing more for the time being, but simply update to see what happens then. To see if we can then perhaps find levels, the particularly 2021, yes, have not been traded much, because that can also be exciting as a rejection. Of course, we now have the whole thing here very, very broadly, because we have always started from the POC here. Then the 80% and everything else next to it will now be shown. This means that we now want to take a correspondingly sharper approach. And for example, we now want to increase the price levels to 6. And from this max volume, we will also go down a little and say 50, and then we'll start with this in order to have better zones here, which are simply smaller than what we want. We always look at the largest POC and then at the lower rated areas. Now we can see that here, for example, there was very little trading in it, and there was also little trading in it. I'll make a bit bigger for you. Then it becomes clear that this is more likely to be one of the thinner areas, and we can visualize this very, very well. If we take an even more aggressive approach to show these areas, we can also set how everything should be displayed. Here again, whether the levels should end at the end of the day, and whether we want to see all or just the broken or unbroken ones, we have many options here again. The entire thing again, whether only in the body or only in the wig or both, and whether area or outline, depending on what you can see better. Here again, the familiar functions extend. Right, if I turn this off, the whole thing ends at the lists chart bar or advanced coloring. We also have the option to work here with more buyers and more sellers. Now makes less sense in the areas, but we have built in the option anyway, in case there should be this special application. Then we also have the color selection here. So how we work with it, and whether we rather with a stronger opacity or I want to have low opacity. These are the volume clusters for now, but the whole thing again as a delta. Let's take a look at that now. I'll switch them all off again first. This can stay like this here, and then we'll go to Money Atlas above, switch to all here. And now we have the option to look at the whole thing here, the max and min threshold. I'll set the min to 0 and the max threshold to 100. And here too, price level account. We also have the option of how many want to be on top of each other. I now recalculate this once with reload. And so we can then filter out areas which have particularly strong clustering in the delta area. So here, where, for example, there would be a larger delta here, and now there are actually relatively many here. To make this a little clearer, I'll make the footprint on the right-hand side here. I'll change from volume to delta. Now we can take a look at where this was always the case, a very strong delta, and can now refine the whole thing here a little and say, I would like to have a delta that was at least at 100, and we can take a little stronger delta values. We take 300 and the whole thing up to 1,000. I forgot to type here. A little moment. Oh yes, it's 1%, of course. Means from 20 to 40% of the no absolute values, the percentage values. That's what I did. Completely forgotten. Now we recalculate this once. And then there are correspondingly fewer areas, which then give us the delta here. And of course, we can also use this to filter something that we might want to trade very finely, especially in the area of footprint trading, order flow trading. So here, for example, these are the corresponding values. Here at the front of the stock, we also had something else, the area here, and can then work with very, very finely and get the whole. We'll set up the same settings here as before for the volume cluster. And here a lot of options, coloring, where it should be located, whether only intraday and so on. Us here and work with it. Again, whether Barclays or per tick should be calculated. And when the whole thing is considered broken, so also very, very diverse, and also offers many exciting trading approaches to work with it. In the next video, we will take a look at something that is only available in this footprint, namely the market memory area. See you soon.